Let's see if we can knock another couple of stories out before I forget how to read again. Welcome back to this shitty little series of Matter of Mystery. Well, this one's Matter of Mystery. There's also Matter of Murder, Matter of Mayhem, Matter of Malice. All the matters that start with M. I don't think there's any digital copy of these stories, so I'm just going to go through and just post them here on YouTube, so at least besides people's, dusty cabinets and closets, they have some other place to exist, because, a lot of work put in them, and these are one of my favorite things from when I was a kid. I had a dark childhood. Well, my neighbor was a serial killer, that probably didn't help any. Okay, that's for another story. I'm not the best at reading, but we'll try it anyway. Okay, the murder on board the Herbert Fuller. It was a warm afternoon in mid-July 1896. The three-masted schooner, D.M. Anthony, was sailing in the South Channel of Nantucket Island off Massachusetts and the Georges Bank in the Gulf Stream near the Nantucket lightships. In the days of the sea, it was accustomed to hail passing ships. On this particular day, Captain Sears Linwood Moore of Harwich was anxious to confirm his schooner's position, so Moore changed his ship's course to be within the hailing distance of one of the other schooners. When the D.M. Anthony was close enough that the ship's first mate, Dave Pierce, hailed the Barquin, Pierce noticed a man on the other ship, which was later identified as first mate Thomas Barham. Barham did not respond to Anthony's hail. Finally, after many unsuccessful tries, the Anthony left with its captain disgusted because of the apparent rudeness of the other ship in failing to respond to the hail. There was a lot of curiosity among the people on the D.M. Anthony as to why the other ship did not respond to their signal. Several of the crew on the Anthony noted the ship's name to be Herbert Fuller, Harrington, Maine. Edward Smith, a seaman aboard the Anthony, made an entry in his diary about the unanswered hail from the Herbert Fuller. Once Smith reached the mainland, he heard that 3 murders had been committed on the Herbert Fuller. Now, this is a long one. He checked his diary and noted that it was the same ship that did not respond to their hails. The 12 people on board the Herbert Fuller were the captain, Charles I, Nash, his wife, Laura Nash, first mate, Thomas Bram, second mate, August W. Bloomberg, ship's steward, Jonathan Spencer, and the crew member, Hendrik Purdock. Francis Lohens, Charles Brown, Henry Slice, Oscar Anderson, and Folk Wasson. The only passenger on board was Lester Monk. This is why I didn't do reading out loud as a hobby. On July 3rd, 1896, the Herbert Fuller sailed out of Long Wharf, Boston. But because of the bad weather, the ship had been anchored in the roadstead, a place less enclosed where ships may ride at anchor, until the 8th of July, when it finally left the wharf. It was accompanied by a schooner, Jacob M. Haskelley, and the brig Champion. Nothing unusual happened for the first week or so. It was on Monday, at the position of 6 degrees north latitude and 53 degrees west longitude, that things changed for the worse on the Herbert Fuller. It was around supper time, and Captain Nash and his wife went for a leisurely walk, arm in arm, to the starboard. It was a beautiful night with a moderate breeze. Later that evening, Bram stepped up to the captain and addressed him. No one could hear what was said, but later Bram remarked that it wasn't natural. What Bram meant had never been explained, yet it was later believed that this statement may have had something to do with the murders. Sorry, I'm for now. From 8 p.m. until 8 p.m. until midnight, second mate Bloomberg was in charge of the starboard. Seaman Henry Slice took up the wheel for 8 to 10 that evening. At 9 o'clock it began to rain, but it was only a squall. Captain Nash came out to speak with the second mate Bloomberg. Shortly after, the skipper retired to the chamber room. When the view from above looked forward from the stern, the cabin appeared to be divided into many compartments. Captain Nash's chamber was located on the lower right. The man at the wheel stood just a few feet from his window. The room in the front of the chart room was occupied by passenger Lester Monk, and the corner room on the upper right was occupied by Miss Nash. Midnight was the most hated period of the graveyard watch. All was quiet on board, with almost everything but the watch fast asleep in their beds. It was a time when superstition, visions, and ill thoughts often entered the minds of seamen. After midnight, First Mate Thomas Bram assumed the watch. Charles Brown took over the wheel from Seaman Slice, and Purdock went forward to his bunk. 2 hours passed. Lester Monk, who had retired early that evening, had to lock his door so its rattling, caused by the ship's rocking on the waves, would stop. A short time later, Monk was woken suddenly by a piercing scream of a woman in the next cabin. A moment later, there was a silence, then a guttural noise coming from the chart room, which was on the opposite side of the room. Monk grabbed his revolver from under his pillow and grabbed a cartridge box. Still in his pajamas, he ran to the chart room. It was dimly lit by the light from the forward cabin lamp. The captain was lying on the floor by the overturned cot. Shocked, Monk tried to arouse him. "Captain Nash!" shouted Monk. "What happened? Are you all right?" But the only response he got was a guttural-like noise coming from Nash's throat. Monk pulled his hand onto the captain's shoulder. It was wet with what Monk thought was at first to be sweat. Later was determined to be blood. He decided that the captain was near dead. He rushed over to Mrs. Dash's cabin and found an empty bunk. He had also noticed that there were splashes of blood on the pillow. Monk walked away in a daze towards the mainmast. "Mr. Bram," shouted the frightened Monk, the revolver still in his hand. Bram turned around and, seeing the revolver in Monk's hand, picked up a plank and threw it at Monk. The plank was caught in the hatchway, missing the startled passenger. "Come below, the captain has been murdered. Come below, for God's sakes," shouted Monk. Bram and Monk went down to the chart room. The guttural noise was still coming from Captain Nash's throat, which meant he was still dying. Bram refused to go near the captain. Instead, he went back to the deck while Monk got dressed and went quickly topside. Monk suggested waking up the crew, but Bram confided that the second mate is forward with the crew. Someone has set back the cabin clock. Bram began to sob and begged Monk to protect him from the crew. "I've been hard on them and they will kill me," Bram pleaded. Shortly after, Bram became sick. The two men decided to stay together until the dawn. When daylight came, the two men walked forward to the galley and woke the ship's steward, Jonathan Spencer. "The captain has been murdered," Monk told Spencer. "Oh, I guess not," came the unbelieving answer from the steward. "Well, you better go and look for yourself then," Monk told him. The three men proceeded aft, and Bram asked Steward, "Have you got a gun?" "No, sir," replied Spencer. "Here, take this one." Bram gave him his revolver. Spencer took the gun and discharged it into the water. What the fuck is going on? He walked over to the skylight of the chart room and saw the captain's body on the floor. Horrified, Spencer went below quickly to get a closer look at the body. As he looked at the body, he noticed the second mate's door open and saw noticeable blood spots on the floor. In the bunk was the second mate with his head cut wide open. Spencer ran back to the men and shouted, "Mr. Bloomberg has bled to death. What does this all mean?" Lester Monk turned to Mate Bram and asked, I thought you told me that the second mate was forward. How did you explain this? Bram slightly replied, he was forward. Lohek, who was at the wheel, was asked if he saw anything unusual that night, to which he promptly replied, now, why did they throw the gun overboard? After asking Lohek if he saw anything, the three men were standing near the riggings on the starboard when Bram pointed out the axe. There's the axe that did it. Both Spencer and Monk looked, but there was nothing to be seen. They all walked over and found the axe partially concealed under the lashing plank. There was blood all over it. Bram and Monk wanted to throw it overboard. Spencer disagreed, but before Spencer could stop him, Bram stepped up to the rail and threw the axe into the sea. You shouldn't have done that, shouted Spencer. All right, we'll say that we didn't find the axe, Bram said. What do you take me for, a fool? Don't you know that a man has been seen with you with the axe? Answered Spencer. The matter was dropped, and the other members of the ships were brought topside, where they were given the tragic news. Mrs. Nash was found later in her bunk with her skull smashed in, possibly by the axe. Had Monk missed seeing her in the darkness? After Captain Nash's body had been examined, they found at least 7 wounds were found on his head, roughly the same kind of head injury as Mrs. Nash's injury. Bram was anxious to throw the bodies overboard as to tidy up the cabins, but Seaman Henry Slice was opposed to this. We don't throw the bodies overboard. We must take them in as evidence. And we don't clean the cabin out either. We must leave it just as it is. Reluctantly, all finally agreed. Finally, somebody with some fucking sense. The bodies were lashed amidship in the ship's board and sewed under canvas. The men held a service to the 3 deceased. This must have been a peculiar service, because the murder must have been among the men present as the word of God was read over the bodies of the victims. After the service, the boat was lowered to the sea and towed astern for the duration of the voyage. Bram, the only naval navigator left on board, now became the captain and appointed Charlie Brown and Frank Lohark as first and, Jesus, this is a long one, second mate to the ship Herbert Fuller. The ship Herbert Fuller sailed towards Halifax, the nearest port. The next day, some crew members saw that Charles Brown, furtively throwing a pair of bloody overalls overboard. The men also discovered that he had changed his clothes the night of the murder, claiming he was cold. On Tuesday, July 16, Bram, Spencer, and Monk grabbed Brown while he was asleep and handcuffed him. The entire incident is told just as it was written in the language of the sailor. Okay. On this day, at 5:30 p.m., the steward of said H. Fuller came to me and told me that the sailors all came and made an open statement to him in reference to one of the sailors whose name is Charles Brown. Conduct of guilt in regard of the murder which took place on board said vessel. I at once got each man's statement. We came to the conclusion to put him in iron at daybreak. At 7 p.m., all hands mustered aft and thoroughly searched. No other weapon was given to them but their knives. Each man was then placed a certain distance apart from each other on top of the afterhouse. Myself, the steward, and passenger was stationed amidship, well armed, and kept a good lookout until daybreak. At 5 a.m., Charles Brown was maliced and put in irons. His action all night was very suspicious and got himself all ready, as it were, to jump over the side, but he was well guarded by all hands on board. At 1:30 he made an effort to rush for the forward part of the ship, but was instantly stopped by the steward upon pointed revolver towards him. Note, it is interesting that Herdick It is interesting that Hendrik Purdock is conspicuous by his absence on this document. It appears that there were only 3 murders that night, but nowhere does Purdock's name reappear in the saga. His role and whereabouts pose a mystery within this bizarre tale. Okay. On Saturday morning, they sighted Sable Island, 180 miles southwest of Halifax. The next day, Oscar Anderson told Monk of an amazing conversation he had with Charles Brown. According to Anderson, Brown had told him that on the early morning of the murder, he had seen through the chart room window what appeared to be Bram striking someone on the cot while Brown was at the wheel. This was followed by the shriek from Mrs. Nash, which was heard by Lester Monk. Charles Brown also told Anderson that he saw Bram coming up to the deck through the front ward hatch. Brown, scared that he would be next, said nothing and stayed at the wheel until relieved later in the morning. Upon hearing this, Monk agreed with Anderson, so both men went to get Spencer, and together they seized first mate Bram. Bram did not resist as they cuffed him, but to be on the safe side, they covered him with a revolver. Bram said, "Don't ill-treat a man, for I am innocent." With Bram in handcuffs, the Herbert Fuller was without a navigator. Monk knew little navigation from yachting, and as a result, served as a navigator for the remainder of the voyage. Hell of a trip. Early Tuesday morning, a Halifax pilot came aboard, and after hearing of the bizarre story, guided them to the harbor. Once they reached land, all were placed under guard and then sent to Boston, where they were placed in the Charles Street jail. Lester Hawthorne Monk and ship steward Jonathan Spencer were released under bail, but were told to stay ready until the trial. The others in the crew were confined to the jail until the trial. After a long trial, First Mate Jonathan Bram was found guilty on 3 murder charges, but on the account of a technicality, the trial was erased. Another trial was held, and the jury again found Bram guilty on the charges. Because of the rules of the American justice system, a lot of evidence was not admitted in court. From all reports, however, it appears that Thomas Bram had a relatively seedy past. An example of this was similar to the fact evident that Bram was charged at Rio de Janeiro from a barquentine White Wing from the banquetine? I can't pronounce that word. Barquentine White Wing, because he had tried to take command of the vessel. A certain seaman, Nicholas of Baltimore, said that Bram had proposed that together they killed the captain of the White Wing. If Nicholas liked the captain too much to kill him, then Bram would take him aboard a Norwegian ship to carry out roughly the same plan. In addition, Bram was caught collecting freight money from the ship Twilight. Bram had also been selling the coconut cargo from another ship, the China, illegally. Even though the jury did not hear this evidence, they still were enough facts to convince both of the juries that Thomas Bram was guilty of the horrendous murder on the Herbert Fuller. It has also been considered by many that Charles Brown could have also been the guilty party. Could he have been the murderer? Charles Brown would have had to leave the wheel of the Herbert Fuller, sailing at 8 knots with a moderate sea running, to go below and kill with an axe 3 people in separate rooms, giving each body several blows to the head, then returning to his position at the wheel without being detected by the officer in charge of the watch, who on this particular night was First Mate Thomas Bram. In the professional opinion of Captain Oliver S. Pickham, Captain Eugene S. McNone, and Captain Odeber R. Fall, not only was Bram, but everyone else on the boat would have noticed the course change. Charles Brown done what he had hypothesized. As a result, Bram was given a life sentence on July 12, 1898, and was sent to the federal prison in Atlanta, Georgia. On August 28, 1913, he was freed on parole, and on April 22, 1919, President Woodrow Wilson granted him full pardon. On July 18, 1919, the Boston Evening Transcript published a letter from Thomas Bram to his lawyer, James E. Cotter, stating, This is the closing chapter of a wonderful case." He ended the letter by thanking his lawyer. After his release from prison, Thomas Mead Chamber Bram became a successful sea captain and later prosperous peanut wholesaler. Okay, that's a change. Bram married an English woman and moved to Jacksonville, Florida, where he was interviewed by several New England sea captains one day, many years after the murder on board the Herbert Fuller. "Now, Tom Bram," one of the captains shouted, you know that you killed those people. Why don't you admit it?" Bram's face darkened, and yet he never answered the question. Yet everyone in the room could sense his feeling of guilt. In 1948, Captain Thomas Bram, then 85 years old, moved out of Jacksonville to return to Georgia without his wife. This was the last we have heard of him. As for the ship Herbert Fuller, it was considered an unlucky vessel, clouded under the shadows of 3 gruesome murders. Finally, the owner changed the ship's name to Margaret B. Rouse on February 4th, 1917. The Margaret B. Rouse sailed from Florida with all cargo of lumber for Genoa, Genoa, Italy, on the evening of April 27, 1917. While the Margaret was in the Mediterranean, a German torpedo struck her starboard side. Amidship, the crew took to the lifeboats, and the German destroyer destroyed her with a well-placed bomb. This was the final day of the Margaret, or should we call her the Herbert Fuller? Jesus. There are still many unanswered questions in the people's mind to exactly what happened that fateful July evening in 1896. I'm thinking the 1800s, but this ship sunk in the war. They're that fucking close. You wouldn't think this was just before World War I, pretty much. Why would Charles Brown have bloody overalls, and why did he throw them overboard as if he was trying to destroy evidence? Why did Charles Brown say he saw Bram strike someone on the cot in the chart room? Why did Bram say second mate was forward when he was obviously dead in his bunk? Why did Bram, who claimed innocence, know exactly where to find the bloody axe, which was carefully hidden under the planks? Something flickered. What happened? I think the power's going out. Could the Brown and Bram have been working together? Why did Bram take the whole blame if Brown was involved? Why did Bram throw the axe overboard and just to throw the bodies over us also? Did Monk merely overlook the body of Mrs. Nash in her stateroom? How could he have done so if he noted that her bunk was empty and there was blood on her pillow? If she was not in her bunk, how can it be that she was found there later? These unanswered questions classify this case as yet another unsolved mystery. Alrighty. Alright, that wasn't too bad, all things considered. You can do this little snippet right here, and we'll call that one A more done. In 1896, life was operating much at a slower pace in Nova Scotia, but that was not the case everywhere else. It was in 1896 that George Washington Carmack discovered gold in the Klondike, triggering the famous gold rush. The gold rush was... I think there should be better grammar there. Triggering the famous gold rush. Within weeks, Dawson City and the Canadian Yukon Territories would spring up as the City of Gold. In Canada, the government of Nova Scotia's only Prime Minister, Charles Tupper, resigned as his new government is formed under Sir Wilfrid Laurier. In the United States, the president is Governor Cleveland. While all this is happening, Lieutenant Robert E. Peary is off on his 6th expedition to the Arctic. The population of Canada was only 20% of what it is today, just over 5 million people. A 3-bedroom home would have cost around $2,300, but if you're making an average income around $400 a year, although that does not seem like much money today, things were a lot cheaper then. For instance, eggs would sell at 5 cents a dozen, and a loaf of bread would cost 15 cents. As for a liter of milk, well, it was only 12 cents. However, inventors were hard at work, paving the way for the 20th century. 1896 was the year that Henry Ford drove his first test car, which would be on the market in less than 8 years. In sports, in 1896, was the year that the Olympics were reborn, with the first of the modern-day Olympics being staged in Athens, Greece. The theater was popular in 1896, with Anne Held as the leading actress. Barnum and Bailey Circus were going from community to community. In art, no idea how to pronounce that. Toulouse-Lautrec painted his famous Ellis, as art began to shift from the traditional to more modern styles. And finally, it was the year that Cracker Jack, a popular caramel-covered peanut popcorn, came onto the market. Ah, yes, 1896, quite the year. All right. Next one is going to be Ghost in the early 1800s. That's only the Petrified Woman. That's one of my favorites. That's not surprising. Although it is long. Ooh, we got a real photo of this one. All right, that's going to be for the next one. And yeah. All right, guys, thanks for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.